This is the Discussions in Body Art podcast, where health inspectors and other regulators, body art facility owners and managers, practitioners, and others can hear concise information about body art safety. If you're interested in bite-sized body art information, this is the podcast for you. My name is John Johnson and I'm your host. Please see Session 0 for disclaimers. Welcome to this series where I'm reviewing body art health codes from around the United States. I've got plenty of experience reading, evaluating, and discussing body art codes, and I think I'm pretty skilled at revealing loopholes and communicating where there's room for improvement. Few body art health codes existed before the mid-1990s, and there were even fewer in the 1980s. They're not updated often, maybe every 8 to 10 years or so. This means they're updated at a rate much slower than the industry's technology and information advancements. This means body artists often consider the codes where they live and work to be outdated and sometimes a barrier to progress. Imagine being a body artist working in a state with a health code with very little or even zero updates since the 1990s. Imagine being a health inspector who's not an expert in body art and inspecting studios and enforcing an antiquated code. I'm doing these sessions to offer objective review, not to be judgmental or insulting. If you're a body art studio owner or manager, I think this series will help you sharpen your critical thinking in the way that you manage your day-to-day operations. If you're an inspector, I think your takeaway is insight into how body artists think. Early body art regs were written with little to no input from industry professionals, or at least professionals experienced or qualified to consult on their creation. But again, everything advances, and today, there are plenty of seasoned professionals capable of contributing to the legislative process. In this series, I'm going to randomly select a state. Which state I won't reveal out of fairness and tell you my thoughts on their code. I'm not going to read entire codes to you verbatim. I'm going to share with you things that might be relevant and offer my thoughts. If you haven't listened to Session 0 of this podcast, go ahead and listen to that too for disclaimers. At the time of this recording, I'm a member of the APP's Legislation Committee, but this podcast session, and all the others, are in no way associated with the Association of Professional Piercers or any of its committees, their members, or other educators. For the first session in this series, I've picked a state whose code I'm only a little familiar with. Here we go. There's two separate documents here. The one I'm starting with is more about public health policy and adjacent topics. The other is mostly regarding licensing. We start the code with only a few definitions for what a piercing, tattoo, a piercer, a tattooist, and their respective studios are, and temporary locations, which are fixed locations, for no more than a week in conjunction with an event where body art is the primary function, basically meaning a tattoo convention. What I take away from this is that you wouldn't be able to set up a booth or some kind of station to provide body art at a temporary event like a music festival or pride celebration. It does move into standard issue licensing requirements for studios and temporary locations. Then we read licensed medical offices and clinics of a person licensed by the medical board and facilities that only perform ear piercings are exempt from licensing requirements. It doesn't say this, but I assume that the reference to ear piercing is intended to mean earlobe piercings with a piercing gun. If so, can piercers in this state pierce any part of the ear with a gun, using the literal language of the code? Or can you pierce with needles as long as it's only on some part of the ear? It's unfortunate that a health code would treat ear piercing, regardless of who performs it or the methods they use, to be exempt. There's some normal zoning requirements, renewal information, and grounds for licensing refusal. This was interesting because it makes references to violent crime and drug-related offenses. This makes me ask if there's other industries where this is a consideration for licensing. There's a paragraph for suspension and revocation of licenses, and this is really interesting. It makes reference to the misrepresentation of tattoos or body jewelry. It doesn't expand on that topic, but the language used in the manufacturing of body jewelry and its sales varies quite a bit. Piercers often buy super low quality body jewelry for their studios, and it's usually labeled as surgical, for example, when in reality there's nothing surgical about the material at all. Manufacturers of inexpensive and what we often consider low quality jewelry don't necessarily know or care about materials. They just want to market their wholesale products to piercers. Piercers often only know what the packaging says and not much more. Health inspectors will likely know even less. If this code even had jewelry material requirements, they're extraordinarily hard to enforce. It says here the license could be suspended if the license holder is found to be intoxicated while on the premises. If you're a health inspector listening now and know of any other industry where this is in a health code, please let me know. Like, was there a widespread problem with this in body art, or is this just profiling of body art studio owners? After some other similar content, we get to some safety information. Workers in the studio shall take precautions to prevent the spread of infection. This is a generic sentiment, but they offer a few bullet points. First is using germicidal soap to clean the hands of body artists and the skin of the area to be pierced or tattooed. This is unfortunate because following the code means a body artist can't use the many other antiseptic products, probably superior products, to clean the skin of their clients. There's no mention of mucous membranes like inside the nose or mention of the mouth like for tongue piercings. Also, if you go to the doctor for any procedure, they're not using soap to prep your skin. I'm not trying to compare body art to medical procedures. I think that's risky and often exaggerated, but I do think it's worth mentioning in this case. Wearing clean apparel and rubber gloves is next. Then using sterile tools and keeping the studio or temporary location in sanitary condition. Requiring practitioners to wear rubber gloves isn't very thorough. If this code is ever updated, this needs to be expanded quite a bit. They could include some fundamentals like when to change gloves, which gloves specifically should be used, like nitrile material, which is a synthetic rubber. Just requiring rubber gloves, which is all it says, allows for all glove types like those we might use to wash our dishes and are reusable. There's a lot of other hand hygiene topics that could be included too. We could also explore the requirement for keeping the location in a sanitary condition. The way it's written leaves what is and is not sanitary up for debate. Sanitary is in the eye of the beholder. There's a line that reads, "A tattooist or person who performs body piercing shall use tools and equipment for tattooing or body piercing that have been properly sterilized and kept in a sterile condition." Unfortunately, sterilization practices in body art aren't exactly uniform. Concepts and practices of sterilization are largely passed down from mentor to apprentice. That doesn't mean they're necessarily bad or insufficient, but a health inspector who has little or no official training in sterilization at the level of a medical clinic, dentist office, or a body art facility won't likely be proficient in evaluating a studio's sterilization program. There's just some super basic practices that a lot of practitioners follow because that's how it's always been done, and others who take sterilization practices to the next level. The code says tools must be properly sterilized and kept in sterile condition, and that will mean different things to different practitioners and different inspectors. It says tools and equipment shall be sterilized by steam pressure treatment in an autoclave, which is easily the most common sterilization method for studios. But this particular state is one of 2 states I'm currently aware of that allow dry heat sterilizers. There's likely others, but I personally wish this wasn't so. Dry heat wouldn't be very efficient for instruments used in body art. Also, if someone's using dry heat sterilizers, it's probably because they can be very inexpensive to buy, and those machines probably aren't intended for instruments like ours. It also says needles and instruments shall be kept in clean, dust-tight containers when not in use. This is insufficient language about storage. It doesn't mention sterilization pouches. This language makes sense if it's referring to studios that use time of use sterilization, but that's not mentioned in the code. In the previous section, it said tools need to be kept in sterile condition, but what about a studio with clean instruments stored in a container for time of use sterilization? Owners-operators are required to notify the health department of infections resulting from a tattoo or piercing as soon as they're discovered. This is tricky. We rely on doctors to diagnose infections. Unhealed piercings and tattoos can have many different problems, and skilled professionals are usually pretty good at troubleshooting and finding solutions. Doctors, on the other hand, don't understand body art in the same way, and a client who visits a doctor is most likely going to be told they have an infection and given antibiotics, which will do little to nothing if the problem isn't a bacterial infection. Again, there's a large range of possible complications during healing, not just infections. The only solution to body jewelry that doesn't fit properly in a piercing is a new piece of jewelry that fits properly. The client's condition will only remain or even get worse until that jewelry is replaced, and all the antibiotics in the world won't change anything. The operators of the studio are required to allow an inspection at any time the studio is operating. There must be a reasonable amount of time given to correct any violations. I think this is fair. We could have a big discussion, though, on how severe different violations might be and what amount of time is reasonable. The word reasonable will mean different things to different people. There are, however, fines for violations that can be as high as $5,000 per day if they continue. There's a lot of content here regarding penalties and timelines and notifications and hearings and certified mail and judicial review and civil penalties. A lot of that's over my head and outside my experience. This part of the code ends with a section with emergency orders. There's some more legal content, and there's reference to immediate and serious threat to human health and shooting, stabbing, or other violent acts or offenses involving drugs occurring at the studio or involving a tattooist or piercer from the studio. That's just really weird to me, but this code is pretty old. This other, more administrative-related code says clients receiving tattoos and piercings must be 18 years old, with some exceptions, and need to provide a valid government ID. It's worth mentioning that it says valid ID. It's rare, but it does happen, that a client brings in an expired ID. They're, of course, going to be disappointed to be turned away, thinking this detail is trivial. The expiration date doesn't change their identity, only the privilege that ID gives them, like access to the university library or legally driving a car. I do love that it specifically says government ID and offers driver's licenses, passports, and military IDs as examples, each with a picture and date of birth on them. There's no allowance for school IDs. I wish this was addressed specifically, even if it's to not allow them. Clients may carry a school ID believing it legitimate. It's not impossible for a university student to consider their school ID acceptable when they enter a body art studio. Reading on just a few lines, minors can receive a tattoo with no mention of minimum age if the tattoo was a cover-up of an existing one. In this case, the existing tattoo must contain obscene or offensive language or symbols, and the examples listed are gang-related names, symbols, or markings, drug-related names, symbols, or pictures, or some other type of words, symbols, or markings that the parent, guardian, or a court considers would be in the best interest of the minor to cover. So only cover-up tattoos for kids. This seems focused on gang and drug-related tattoos on children, but when we use words like obscene or offensive, we open things up to interpretation. I wonder if there's ever been a situation where a tattoo artist denied a cover-up service because they didn't think a child's tattoo was offensive, and there's nothing in the code about refusing services under this circumstance. The parent or guardian must provide evidence of their status as parent or guardian with an affidavit stating that the person is the parent or guardian. Provide evidence of the minor's identity to the artist. They must be present for the tattoo, and provide the studio with a written detailed description or photograph of the tattoo to be covered up, which is to be kept with the studio's records. And lastly, the full name, address, and telephone number of the parent or guardian. Similarly, piercing cannot be formed on anyone under 18 without consent of a parent or guardian. The studio will have on record a written and notarized consent by the child's parent, conservator, or guardian, which shall contain the full name, address, and telephone number of both the client and the parent, conservator, or guardian, the location on the body that will be pierced, and the signatures of the minor and parent, managing conservator, or guardian. If a parent or guardian needs a notary service for the consent form, does this mean that they print out or pick up the form and take it to a notary? Does this mean there's a notary on staff at studios that offer piercing? I don't know the laws regarding notary stuff. If you do, let me know. The parent, conservator, or guardian must be present at the time of the piercing and execute an affidavit stating their relationship to the child and provide evidence of the minor's identity. There's some redundancy in the code with this notary and affidavit language, but if you've listened to session 0 of this podcast, you'll know I'm no legal expert or anything like that. There's also no examples of an acceptable ID for a minor. There's also no minimum age in this code for a minor getting pierced. But the code is very old and written by people who weren't predicting that moms would be calling studios to get price quotes for a tongue piercing for their 12-year-old or nipple piercings for their 15-year-old. No one can be tattooed or pierced if they appear to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The problem with this is the burden on the studio's personnel to make this determination. Does the specific practitioner have the final say? If they turn the client away, can another practitioner say they disagree with the previous practitioner's assessment and perform the service? Does a single beer or glass of wine render someone under the influence, or are there specific conditions that must be observed? Those exact same clients can drive a car as long as their blood alcohol content doesn't pass a legal limit. We have measurable metrics for driving after drinking. What's the legal limit for body art? Do we need to have breathalyzers or blood tests in the studio? Before receiving a piercing, clients are to be told verbally and in writing that piercings have risks such as scarring, bleeding, swelling, infection, nerve damage, and increased risk for adolescents. Similarly, before receiving a tattoo, clients are to be informed of the possible dangers associated with each tattoo. Examples listed include their permanence, discomfort, the risk of infection, and allergic reactions to pigments. It says the studio or temporary location shall maintain records of each client. The information shall be permanently recorded and made available for examination by an authorized agent. Records shall be maintained at the studio for at least 2 years following the date of the last entry. For the temporary location, client records shall be maintained by the license holder. The information is to be permanently recorded, but for a studio only on site for 2 years. I suppose after that their storage is up to the license holder, the same as it is for temporary locations. Now that we're in the digital age, I imagine there's not much issue with record keeping like this. So many studios are using electronic systems now. The next several lines of code go on to describe requirements of client records, including the colors of tattoos, jewelry used for piercing, and verification that the client received and understands aftercare instructions. I think that last part, that the client must understand the aftercare instructions, is subjective. How does a body artist verify someone's understanding? It goes on to say the records custodian must permit an authorized agent to have access to them at a reasonable time. Reasonable is a subjective word. I think better language would read something like the agent must have access during the location's business hours, like it requires access for a health inspection. In this code, at the end, it's made clear that a minor who fraudulently presents documents stating they're over 18 is committing a misdemeanor. And lastly, in this code, we don't learn what kind of offense knowingly performing body art on a minor is. Thanks for listening to the Discussions in Body Art podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Questions, comments, and suggestions can be sent to john@newflowerstudio.com. Find me on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/JohnJ562. If you want to help me out, suggest this podcast to your peers and subscribe on Patreon for exclusive content, and visit newflowerstudio.com/NFW/podcast to learn more.